items that just do not make any sense to ask in an African context. So, for instance, one of these scales has an item that says, I would vote for a Black politician. For a lot of citizens in Kenya, as well as in Ghana, there are no alternatives. You must vote for Black politicians because they're the only one on the ballot. So there's also stereotype content that's very specific to the United States and things like that. They're also all developed by clinical psychologists, so they're extremely long. The shortest scale is 36 items, which is far too long for a social survey. And the items are very blunt. So for instance, one scale has an item that just says, I wish I were white. And so the result is very low means and truncated variance, which is not ideal in terms of conducting analyses. So I wanted to develop a scale that specifically centers African experiences of racialization and racial dynamics. I also wanted to conduct hypothesis testing. So first, I did want to try to identify causation of colonial mentality's effects. So I designed an intervention that aimed to reduce colonial mentality. Unfortunately, it did not work. So I'll show you what it is, and maybe you'll have some insights for why it didn't work or what could be better. But then I also investigated its link to political attitudes and behavior. So as I mentioned, I'll present results today about internal political efficacy and perceptions of ethnic discrimination. I also in the project looked very extensively through over a dozen items at whether colonial mentality is something that alters African citizen, and in this case specifically Kenyan citizens' evaluations of their own governments. So we might expect, based on stereotypes, people experiencing colonial mentality to think that their government is performing worse. I did not, in fact, find any evidence for that across any of the items. So. In terms of who participated in the survey, it was all Kenyan citizens because we wanted folks who were able to fully participate in politics, all racialized as Black or of African descent, aged 18 to 60 years inclusive. They had to be fluent in Kiswahili because the survey was exclusively in Kiswahili. And then they had to be residing in one of our target locations. As it was a dissertation, I had a more limited budget and I did not have a nationally representative sample. So it was a convenience sample. But what we did is we broke it up into several sites and administration modes to try to increase diversity. So about half of the participants took the survey online without any assistance. They were recruited in the Nairobi area, but they're going to be higher socioeconomic status. So these are all folks who have smartphones and who are have enough education that they feel comfortable completing the survey on the smartphone. We also then interviewed about 300 people in person, and this was split across Nairobi, as well as Machakos, which is a county capital. It's about a mid-sized town, about an order of magnitude smaller than Nairobi, and it's about an hour outside of Nairobi. So the respondents in these in-person samples tended to be lower socioeconomic status. Overall, it is not anywhere close to nationally representative, but there is really excellent variation on education, and that's good because we know education explains some variation in colonial mentality, and it does not have all of the largest ethnic groups represented, but it is representing both ethnic groups that have historically high rates of contact with whites, as well as those that have historically low rates of contacts based on patterns of white settlement during the colonial era. It unfortunately underrepresents Muslims. So that's something I'm going to be trying to correct during my work in Ghana, especially because religion is theoretically linked to colonial mentality owing to the work of missionaries, but also it overrepresents women because they happen to be at home when they were approached for the survey. There is not a lot to suggest substantial gender differences in colonial mentality, so that shouldn't be as much of a problem. Um, You have probably noticed at this point, I am a white American, and so ensuring that the research was socially beneficial was a very big concern in undertaking the research. In terms of what it actually looked like, all of the research team who were present in and actively involved in collecting data were Black Kenyans. However, the consent process did say very explicitly that the principal investigators on this project are white Americans. So people did have that knowledge going in. But the hope was that by having only African enumerators present, that people would feel more comfortable being critical if they felt critical. There also was an addition based on early stage feedback that I received in Kenya of a module at the end of the survey that did a few different things. So first, it explained that the research was actually about colonial mentality, defined what colonial mentality is, and explained why Kenyan perspectives on this are especially important. It then asked participants, is there anything important that you think the researcher should know? So they could provide feedback either on experiences of colonial mentality or what they thought of the research. And then finally, at the very end, participants were asked, now that you know that what the research is about, do you want to keep your answers in the survey or do you want to withdraw all of your answers? And if you withdraw all of your answers, you'll still receive your payment for your time today. So the purpose of this was to really hopefully eliminate any financial considerations as an incentive for participation so that if folks did feel uncomfortable with the research, they would actually be willing to withdraw. So I did a lot of work prior to the survey in terms of trying to get a new measurement approach ready. First, I spent a lot of time reviewing existing literature, especially accounts from Kenya and from African countries more broadly, and also did a series of focus groups in Kenya. From those, I generated a list of about 40 items, and then I had five experts working at either universities or other research institutions in Kenya review all of these proposed items. And I eliminated about half of them, either because the experts did not think that they were especially relevant, or because there were concerns about how the ideas would translate and whether they would be clear in Kiswahili. And then I fielded the survey. I did some analyses to construct the scale and understand how the items went together. So this is where I identified the two different types, the pragmatic and the ideological. And I did try to validate this new measure as well. So I mentioned that prior research shows that colonial mentality declines with education. And I did, in fact, find that pattern as well as several other pre-existing patterns to have pretty good confidence that the scale is measuring what we think it's measuring. So I have here just a sample of the items on the scale that seemed to perform the best relative to other items, that were the strongest relative to other items. So the top shows a few items from the pragmatic colonial mentality dimension. You can see these items tend to emphasize associations between whiteness and wealth, and they tend to express in some way that the idea that proximity to whites can help facilitate access to wealth and personal success. The bottom shows instead items that seem to focus on an ideological dimension. So these are the items that go beyond recognition of inequality to active endorsement of inequality. So we see ideas like the best schools are going to have white teachers, that whites are more civilized than Africans, and that African tribes will never get along. So a lot of these in particular are attached to stereotypes that European colonizers promoted to try to justify colonial rule. This slide shows the distribution of colonial mentality among respondents. So if we classify someone who on average slightly agrees with these statements as experiencing colonial mentality, we can see the percent of respondents who seem to be experiencing colonial mentality. This is shown in purple. So I've broken down on the left panel pragmatic colonial mentality, on the right panel, ideological colonial mentality, and then we can also see broken down by the different subsamples in the survey. So if we're looking at pragmatic colonial mentality, a majority of respondents in every subsample experienced this. It ranged from on the lower end about 65% to on the higher end about 80%, depending on the subsample. Ideological colonial mentality was more rare. So depending on the subsample, it ranged from about 25 to 33% of participants. And there is a modest positive correlation, about 0.45, between these two dimensions. The way that this manifests is that essentially anyone who is experiencing ideological internalized racism typically also experiences pragmatic internalized racism, but not everyone who is expressing pragmatic colonial mentality also expresses ideological. So it's rare to have ideological without pragmatic, but it is fairly common to have both pragmatic and ideological. I mentioned that I did an experimental intervention to try to causally identify colonial mentality's effects. This intervention was based on psychology literatures in the US that use counter-stereotypical exemplars to reduce racial stereotyping. So actually, a lot of these studies in the United States focus on Barack Obama as a counter-stereotypical exemplar. So one of the things I did in the early stage research in focus groups, for instance, was to try to identify viable counter-stereotypical exemplars that would work well across all Kenyans to reduce stereotyping. So Wangari Maathai is actually one of the counter-stereotypical exemplars that I used. So you can see the passage that participants read here with key portions highlighted in bold. So the key portions emphasize especially that Wangari Maathai saw Africans as capable of solving their own problems and did not want them to rely on outsiders and did not think that they needed to rely on outsiders, that they were capable of solving their problems on their own. They also emphasize that Wangari Maathai was recognized as a leader not just in Kenya, but actually people throughout the world saw what she was doing was good. And so other countries from around the world would send representatives to Kenya to learn about the Greenbelt movement so that they could go back and replicate in their own societies. So unfortunately, this treatment did not seem to work the way that we intended it to. So this figure has a lot going on. Basically, moving from left to right, we see different subsamples, and then the top panel focuses on relatively low education respondents and the bottom on relatively high. I blocked on education because of the known association. The left box plots in each box show pragmatic colonial mentality, the right show ideological. And the purple shows the control group, the green shows the treatment group. So again, a lot going on. The bottom line here is that there were not substantial differences and there were not significant differences as a result of the treatment, so that we either did not choose good counter-stereotypical exemplars or using counter-stereotypical exemplars didn't seem to have been effective in this case. So I'm still exploring in the data to try to understand why this didn't work, but I don't have a good understanding right now. So because the intervention did not work, I did observational analyses. So I did logistic regressions that include either pragmatic or colonial or ideological colonial mentality and a number of control variables. Especially relevant for the ethnic discrimination outcomes. All of these models hold all of the results hold in models with ethnicity fixed effects. And actually, if you fit separate models for each ethnic identity, the results are consistent within each ethnic group as well. So the first hypothesis I investigated was that colonial mentality reduces political efficacy. And There is a lot of African scholarship already that makes this argument in qualitative terms. In particular, colonial regimes did not benefit from African citizens wanting to participate actively in politics, and so they did everything that they could to discourage this. And as a result, um, subjects of these regimes basically learned political apathy. This would help explain why in multiple rounds of Afrobarometer across multiple countries, political efficacy, people's confidence to participate in politics remains really persistently low. And it didn't just start low, it has remained low despite, in some cases, 2 or 3 decades of experience participating in democracy, which is something we usually think would increase efficacy. But again, in a majority of countries that Afrobarometer is working in, we still see a majority of respondents expressing very low confidence to participate in politics. So I measured this using a very tried and true classic Afrobarometer item that's appeared on almost every round. That sometimes politics and government seem so complicated that a person like me can't really understand what's going on. So I found that specifically pragmatic internalized racism does predict significantly lower political efficacy. So I have predicted probabilities here, moving from the lowest level of pragmatic internalized racism on the left to the highest level on the right. What we can see is across the board, the most likely response for anyone is to agree with the statement. But we do see that the marginal categories do change a lot across levels of colonial mentality. So, for instance, at the lowest levels of colonial mentality, the probability of strongly agreeing that that government and politics is too complicated is less than 25%. That probability actually more than doubles as you move to the highest level. And conversely, if you look at people who disagree and therefore are expressing confidence to participate in politics, that percentage is halved as you moved from the lowest levels of colonial mentality to the highest levels. So it does seem to matter. It's interesting that this pattern only appears for pragmatic colonial mentality. To me, I interpret this as a sign that this is not some deep-seated belief about ability to participate in politics. It's again reflecting what Albert Memmi talked about as just a habituation of non-participation and resulting lack of confidence. So it's not a deep conviction. It's just a habit. The second set of outcomes I looked at had to do with ethnic identities. The overall relationship with ethnic identification was not clear to me from existing literature. So we know that colonial states forced people within these regimes, especially under indirect rule, to invest in their ethnic identities because the only way to interact with the colonial government was through ethnically based authorities. But at the same time, colonial regimes actively denigrated these identities. So, for instance, schools would prohibit the use of languages associated with these identities. And so that might encourage people to divest from these identities or to disassociate from them. However, it does seem likely that colonial mentality would increase not your own attachment to your ethnic identity, but the expectation that your fellow citizens are governed by their ethnic identities. This again goes back to colonial era stereotypes of Africans as tribalist. And this benefited Europeans because they could paint themselves as a peacemaker coming in to prevent warring among ethnic groups. We know that also in contemporary politics, the main reason that ethnicity seems to matter when it does is not because people feel so strongly attached to their own identity, but because they expect governments and politicians to discriminate along ethnic lines. So there are clear expectations not about the respondents' own attachment, but about how they might perceive others as discriminating along ethnic lines. So to look at ethnic identity strength, I used another very classic Afrobarometer item that asks people whether they feel more close to their national identity or their ethnic identity. And pretty much across the board, there were not consistent significance in these models. So there does not seem to be a clear relationship between your own attachment to your ethnic identity and colonial mentality. But I also looked at reported ethnic discrimination. I used, again, two Afrobarometer items that are a little bit different. So one of them focuses on how often the respondent has been treated unfairly by the government or members of their ethnic group have been treated unfairly by the government. And the second focuses on citizens discriminating against other citizens based on ethnic identities. In this case, it seemed that both pragmatic and ideological colonial mentality significantly predicted greater reports of discrimination by both government and other citizens. So on the left, we see results for government discrimination, moving from the lowest levels of colonial mentality to the highest levels. The most likely response moves from never, the government never discriminates, to either sometimes in the case of pragmatic internal colonial mentality, or in fact to often as the most likely response for ideological colonial mentality. The results are not quite as dramatic for citizen discrimination, but we do see a shift in categories there, a shift in probabilities there as well. The most likely response in any case is never, but the probability of saying that discrimination has occurred many times, again, effectively doubles from the lowest levels to the highest levels of colonial mentality. These results, again, are observational. They are not causally identified. So I think confounding or reverse causation is a very plausible story here. So just to summarize the findings from Kenya, it was not a nationally representative survey, but based on the respondents we still see a relatively wide prevalence of colonial mentality persisting even decades after independence. We also see that colonial mentality seems to matter for political outcomes. And notably, the patterns that we saw in the data suggest that the kind of ideological specter of colonialism might still hurt African governments and undermine accountability. So if people don't feel empowered to hold their governments to account, that's not going to bode well for African governments. And also, if people are only willing to vote for politicians from their group because they're scared of experiencing discrimination from others, they also might not be willing to vote for the best performers. I'm sorry, I am running really slower than I expected. So I'm going to try to move a little bit more quickly now through my research that I'm anticipating in Ghana. This is going to be co-authored with someone who served as one of my expert reviewers in Kenya, Salim Kambo, who is a director at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. I'm going to actually just move really quickly through this slide. There is some existing research from a number of disciplines and sources suggesting that colonial mentality remains a concern in Ghana as well. I can talk more about this in the Q&A. But importantly, there are some notable differences from Kenya. So the history of white contact is several hundred years longer in Ghana and involved also, in addition to colonization, the transatlantic slave trade. On the other hand, the scale of white settlement that occurred during the colonial era in Kenya is not mirrored in Ghana. And also post-independence and independence era leaders in Ghana, notably Kwame Nkrumah, were really deliberate in their efforts to raise racial consciousness in a way that leaders in Kenya weren't always, especially Jomo Kenyatta. So the research that I'm planning is going to unfold in two stages. First are focus groups These are going to highlight groups that are not well represented in existing research, including my research in Kenya. So lower to middle socioeconomic status respondents, and again, moving into more rural areas and also areas with greater presence of Muslim respondents. This is to get a better idea of what colonial mentality looks like in Ghana and what it might be associated with. Then I also have an opportunity to add questions to a nationally representative survey that's going to occur later this year. Most of the survey is going to be focused on a different project, but I will have the opportunity to add some items about colonial mentality. So in terms of measurement, I'm considering adapting something from the US called a feeling thermometer. These are for Americans who are used to working in Fahrenheit, and you rate whether you feel coolly or warmly towards a group. So to adapt that, I'm going to remove the numeric scale, but just ask whether folks feel warmly or coolly to different groups, and then ask the degree to which they feel warmly or coolly. I don't know how well that translates into languages like Fonte or Twi, so I am going to have to learn about that. The other thing that I'm considering doing as an experiment, audiences, especially in the US, are not convinced that race seems to be what matters. So I'm going to present some vignettes adapted from racial surveys in the United States that vary the identity of the people concerned. So either European or American versus African. I'm going to focus outside of Ghana so that people are not reading it through a personal lens. And it's going to describe a situation where discrimination is plausibly occurring, but it could also be explained away as something else. And I'm going to ask, do you think this is a case of discrimination, or do you think that actually there are other things that could explain this and it's reasonable to make this decision? I would expect then, if people are experiencing colonial mentality, to more often say that it's discriminatory when the people involved are African. I'm also planning on adding a scale that Salim and some of his colleagues have developed on civic engagement. So this is moving beyond efficacy to see if colonial mentality actually alters participation in society, in leadership positions and engagement. And then based on some open-ended responses, people in Kenya seem to think that this may be related not to the level of corruption that people perceive, but whether they think corruption is okay. And also very relevant in contemporary Kenyan politics, people might be willing to take on more debt or adhere more to IMF demands if they have higher levels of colonial mentality. Okay, I am so sorry I ran so long, but I am very excited to hear what people have to say. So I can stay for a little bit longer. I don't know if other people can stay, but at least for the remaining time, I'm very excited to hear feedback. And anything that you have to contribute is valuable. It's really early stage, so we still have a lot of opportunity to change or add.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jennifer. That was actually a new niche for us. Very, very interesting area. We haven't had any presentations in our seminar series on colonial mentality. So I'm sure we do have a lot of people who are curious in this audience. So I am preempting the discussion to actually focus more on questions than comments. And perhaps the questions will also give you some feedback on issues that perhaps are not as clear as you would perceive they are, so that you even establish more clarity on it. So at this point, let me not be the takeover. Let me allow our very, very distinguished listeners and audience participants who have been joining us all the time to go ahead and ask you questions. I'd kindly ask you to raise your hand, and then I would call you and we can go ahead with the questions. You can also use the chat function to ask questions, to type in comments, questions, and Jennifer will answer and give you feedback on that. Thank you very much. So, dear participants, the floor is now open for questions, comments, and feedback for Jennifer. Thank you. Okay, I see a hand up here. The director is here with us, Abdul Gafaru, and then also we have a question from Anewamene Mensa. I know he's a student with us. Anewamene, yes, that's his name. Prof would give you the privilege to be the first person,
Oh,
and then
okay.
after Anewamene can give us. Yes, please.
I saw Mr. Anawamene's hand first, but I see
Okay.
oh, never mind. Okay,
Can
we
you,
can
can you hear me?
Yes, please, we can hear you, Prof.
So I'm joining another meeting, and I wanted to post a question at the Q&A, whatever, and I'm told I've been disabled. So I just wanted you to activate it. I posted, and then you can attend to other, participants, and then she could take a look at my question at a later point.
Yes,
Could you,
yes, please.
maybe,
Thank you very much. We would quickly
is it,
disable that, and then in the chat box, Prof. Would that be in the chat box?
yes, I tried to post something, and it says the host has disabled attendee chat.
oh.
Okay, please, we would enable it immediately so you can post your question. And thank you very much. Then, and then
Otherwise, I
can
can
you
also
please,
just
yes,
raise.
or just raise it here,
Otherwise, I
Prof. If
can
you're
also just.
yes,
Yeah,
please, just raise it
so
here.
my question is in relation to the proposed study in Ghana, and more specifically about, the rationale behind the choice of the Greater Accra and Northern regions for the proposed focus group discussions. So these two regions represent the northern and southern zones or belts of, and I was wondering whether you have considered including a middle belt region like Ashanti, because the Ashanti region has had very unique, different colonial encounter. It has a very different socio-political history. And I'm wondering whether, a place like Ashanti could be, or could add an interesting comparative dimension to the kind of analysis that you are seeking to do around the issue of colonial mentality in the Ghanaian context. So that's the question I wanted to pose, or the suggestion I wanted to make in the chat box. And I'm not sure I'll stay even to listen to the answer. I am supposed to be in another meeting, but we will keep this conversation going on. We can reach out. Jennifer and I know each other for some time, so we could take this conversation at another point. Okay, so thank you so much for making time to present your work to us. Thank you. And coordinator, I'm leaving. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you
I
very much.
also, in case other people have to leave, I've put my email address as well. So I'm very happy to respond to emails in case people have to leave. Just very quickly, I did not consider the middle belt. I think maybe you're right. I did specifically choose Accra mainly for financial reasons. That's where the implementing partner is based, and so those will be cheaper. And then, as I mentioned, the northern region was chosen specifically to try to get more remote regions and more Muslim participants, which was really missing in my data in Kenya. But you raise excellent points, so maybe I'll need to revisit that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. I'll just ask Anewamene to ask his question now, and then we'll check the chat box if there's any other questions since the function has been enabled now. Mr. Mensah, Anewamene,
Yeah, Doc.
you can ask your question. Oh, yes,
Doc,
please go ahead.
please, good afternoon, Doctor.
Good
Doc,
afternoon.
please, yeah, yes, please, thank you very much for the opportunity. my really exactly just have to do with the professor's concern about the selection of the Accra and then the northern region. So some of the regions haven't had the real encounter with colonialism. And in Ghana, we know there are some particular regions that the colonial masters, do I say, stayed until independence. So the choice of Greater Accra and then northern region was a little bit. I was a bit concerned. If you could have considered the regions that maybe the colonial masters were very much present, I think that will inform a good research, a good conclusion. Because currently, for instance, we haven't had much history. We've not had much encounter with the colonial masters. So, but I'm just it's just a concern if you could consider those who really had encounter with the colonial masters. I think that will.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left, so I have to interject so that we can see if there's any other feedback. There's no hand up, there's no chat. So, but
I just see some in the chat.
Yes, and
so
there's another question here for you. Kindly hold. Yes.
So just a quick one. It's not exactly a question, just to follow up on the question of the location. So as the last speaker said, some regions had, so I was wondering whether you could then have a comparison. So those who had the experience and those who didn't have too much of the presence of the colonial masters it would be great to know how the colonial mentality is playing out across these different populations, just for you to consider.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denchi. I see a hand up again. Eric Pachasari. But Eric, please make it brief because we have a few minutes and then we have to go off. Kindly go ahead with your question. Hello, Eric, please unmute and go ahead with your comment or question. You are muted, so we can't hear you. Yes.
Okay, please. I'm Eric Asari, a student of MA Social Policy, and I'm pleased to benefit from such an insightful lecture. Thank you very much. My question is, given that colonial mentality predicts this diminished political efficacy in Kenya, how might similar patterns in Ghana influence the design of contemporary social policy interventions, especially those aimed at strengthening civic engagement and national identity? Thank you.
Yeah, I think to be honest, I don't have a great answer to that. I think the research is very early, and so as a result, we don't know a lot. We do know, and this is something I'd like to consider for future research. There are a lot of African organizations that already know this is a problem and are already working to try to counter this problem. And so, for instance, there are several NGOs in the Nairobi area that I've met with throughout my research that were featured in my dissertation that are promoting like let's celebrate African culture and African contributions. And so I think those organizations hold a lot of promise. I also think, though, that based on what we know about racial attitudes, and a lot of this is coming out of the US because there's just more research, these are really resistant to change. And so just a short-term, like one day, one-off interaction is not especially likely to be effective. It takes more long-term intervention. And I think one thing that's really promising is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, writing several decades ago and advocating for education reform, said more educated Africans are experiencing more of this because the curriculum is based on the colonizers. And actually, now we see that relationship has flipped. So people who are more educated actually have lower colonial mentality. And I think that speaks to the strength of education reforms that have occurred in the intervening decades. And suggest, again, it's a longer term intervention. It's centering African culture in the curriculum. And I think those have probably been quite effective as well. So those give us some hints, just kind of based on stories, but there's not really strong kind of quantitative data.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I think there are some questions in the chat. I'll just read them quickly because that would, we are supposed to finish now, but we'll just allow some 5 to 10 minutes for participants that can stay on. So one participant says, I'm curious on which software she's using for analyzing her data. From another participant, would you think in any way that using black enumerators, but in the instrument, the PIs are white, the PIs, that's your principal investigators are hierarchies. Again, what about considering main regions where colonialism has affected? I think that's been widely discussed. And then a colleague is asking you, the use of theater has been known to work on Daniel Apiaje and Sankroma. That's the vessel of our destiny. Can that be useful during the research? So these are all things you could consider. One participant says they just joined. I think they were late in joining, but they ask directly, what is colonial mentality? And please briefly let me know that which you want us to know about colonial mentality. So I think in just a few minutes, if you can summarize something about these questions. Now, I wanted to pose a question as well, and it was mainly on the fact that, in Ghana, we have so many ethnic groups. So I just wonder about how you're really going to be able to clearly distinguish with ethnic group, because I see that in Kenya, you were using, is it a Machakos or Machach? I saw it there, and I'm thinking in my head, even if you decide to use the account, we will tell you that our traditions, our ideology, so both, if you use both the pragmatic or the ideological one, it will differ so widely. So even within the Akan, which is supposed to be the dominant ethnic group where you find over 50% of Ghanaians probably being there, you still would find so many variations even within us that people would tell you that I'm a Kwiapim, but I don't belong to that Santi. I'm Fanti, I don't belong here. So I think you would need to really put these, variations and differences in consideration. Even if you do decide to go into an area where you would find a lot of people that were affected by colonialism. So it's very important that you pay attention to that, please. Okay, so that would be, I think I don't see a hand up, and that would be final. So if you give us feedback on that, we can end. Thank you.
I'll try to move through these really quickly. Thank you, everyone, for the comments and questions. I use R for all my analyses. That's just what I was taught in grad school. I do have concerns about tokenism and racialized power hierarchies being replicated through the research. I did what I could, but I do think, to your point, like there is still substantial room for improvement. I am working with Salim on this part. He made really good contributions. I did approach a Kenyan co-author for the first part, and we did some work together, but the demands on his time were just too great, and so he wasn't able to continue with the project. But I think, yeah, it is a huge concern. It is an extremely valid criticism, and it's something I'm trying to do better on. In terms of theater, yes, I'm really excited to get this comment. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's most famous play, I Will Marry When I Want. Definitely look that up, and I think it will be useful. And I think what I'm learning overall is I have started reading a lot more about social histories in Ghana across different regions, but I think I need to make a lot more investment in that to understand it. And this is So when people think about experiencing ethnic discrimination, do they usually think along Akan lines, or do they think about smaller groups, I guess? Can I ask that as a follow-up to your question, Dr. Sibo Darko? Siboy, sorry.
Okay. I think that you would find that in Ghana, people may or may not be. I think your data is it's not a finding that I can conclude on for you now. Maybe
Okay.
because I'm really not an expert in that field, but it's a consideration you would have to keep in mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's something you have to be very conscious about. And there's also this very widely believed or wide belief. It's not really, but I don't know if it's an accepted belief or not, but we do think that there are some ethnic groups that had more definitely because they were at the coast. But when you go inside into the Ashanti region, maybe because they were more warriors and they fought more against colonialism. So you would find those variances, but just bear all of that in mind before you come. Yeah.
I think if I can add two things, I did find in Kenya there's more variation within ethnic groups than there are across ethnic groups. So it sounds like that may also be the case. And then also,
Exactly.
as one more answer, something else I recalled. So when I present this research, including in the debriefing module at the end of the survey, one thing that I try to do really consistently, I want to be really clear. I am not discovering anything in this research. African scholars and African communities are really well aware of this problem already. So I do not want to take overdue credit. And when I'm presenting, I do always put, hey, it's actually African scholars who have identified this as a problem. And we're interested in measuring this because we think that it's worth investigating and investing in kind of being able to measure and systematically show that these scholars are correct and what they're talking about is still socially relevant. So yeah, just want to be very clear about what I'm doing. I am not inventing, I am not discovering, I am just documenting claims that other people have already made.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you for answering the questions, for your comments, and for your feedback. We want to thank our participants who have joined us. Jennifer, you're privileged today. We have had the Honorable Kojo Oponkroma, who is a member for Parliament, join us online today to listen to your presentation. Our former director and directors of several centers, all faculty of the university have joined us today. Our director herself, our PhD students, MA students, and a host of participants have joined you. In fact, we had over 40 participants, and that also shows you how very interesting your topic is. And once again, we apologize for the initial technical hitch in getting participants to register. We are very, very happy. We look forward to having you come and present again, Jennifer. We wish you the best when you come to Ghana. When you are here, we'll be happy to host you physically.